We ran out of
The project was supposed to take 20 years. That was the original estimate, submitted to the Galactic Institute of Civilizational Sciences by the chief architect of the study, a researcher named Dr. Sorath Ven of the Varath Academy, whose previous work on emotional taxonomy in post-contact civilizations had been considered definitive for nearly a century. 20 years, she had written, was a conservative estimate. Humans were a young civilization, relatively uncomplicated, with an emotional repertoire that preliminary surveys suggested was robust but not structurally unusual. The existing frameworks, developed across 300 years of comparative civilizational study, would require adaptation but not replacement. The project was still running 200 years later. Dr. Ven had been dead for 140 of them. The current lead researcher, a Varath scholar named Assessor Dren Sorath, who was, by the particular bureaucratic coincidence that long institutional projects sometimes produced, a descendant of the project's founder, though the resemblance ended at the name, had inherited both the project and a filing system containing 200 years of data that was organized, as far as he could determine after 3 weeks of attempting to understand it. According to a logic that had made complete sense to the people who built it, and now made almost none. He sat in his office on the morning of his first full day as project lead and read the summary document that his predecessor had left him. The summary was 60 pages long and ended with a sentence that Dren had been turning over in his mind for the 3 weeks since he read it. The sentence was, "We have not run out of data, we have run out of the right questions." The project had been called, in its original charter, the Comprehensive Emotional Cartography Initiative, a name that had seemed appropriately precise in the year it was coined, and which had become, over the following 2 centuries, quietly ironic among the researchers who worked on it. Cartography implied the making of maps. Maps implied bounded territories that could, in principle, be fully described. The researchers who had spent their careers on the initiative had gradually, and in some cases reluctantly, arrived at the conclusion that what they were trying to map was not bounded in any meaningful sense. Not because human emotion was infinite, nothing biological was infinite, but because the structure of it was different from what the existing frameworks assumed. Different in ways that the existing frameworks could identify as different without being able to adequately capture. The first indication of this had come on day 1. Dren had read the original field notes. They were preserved in the project archive with the care that the Varath gave to documents they considered significant, and these particular documents had been considered significant for so long that they had been copied and recopied across successive recording systems for 2 centuries, and were now as legible as the day they were written. Day 1 of the study had been a market day in a city called Istanbul, on the continent of Asia, in a country that called itself Turkey. Dr. Ven had selected this location specifically because she had assessed it as emotionally dense, a place where a wide range of human emotional expression would be visible in a concentrated area in a short amount of time, which would allow her team to calibrate their observation instruments against the existing taxonomy before beginning the formal study. The calibration exercise was supposed to take 4 hours. After 4 hours, the team had identified 37 distinct emotional states that did not fit any existing category. After 8 hours, the number was 62. Dr. Ven had sent a message to the Institute that evening that was preserved in the archive alongside the field notes. It was 3 sentences. The first 2 were procedural. The third said, without elaboration, "I believe the taxonomy will need to be rebuilt from the beginning." Dren spent his first month as project lead reading backwards through 2 centuries of documents rather than forwards through the current data. This was not standard practice for incoming project leads. His senior researcher, a meticulous woman named Assessor Dren, who had been on the project for 30 years, observed this with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen enough project leads come and go to have formed opinions she did not share unsolicited. On the fourth week, she asked him what he was looking for. The moment they stopped being surprised, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Why does that matter? Because the project stopped making significant progress approximately 80 years ago. The publications since then have been thorough and careful, and they have added genuinely useful detail to the existing work. But they haven't changed the fundamental picture in the way the first 120 years of the project changed it. I want to know when the surprise ended, because I think that's when we stopped asking new questions. Lara considered this. Then she said, Year 116, the publication of the Integrated Emotional Framework. What happened to it? It was adopted by the Institute, by the Comparative Civilizational Studies community, by the Galactic Diplomatic Corps as their standard reference. It became the official framework. She paused. And once it became official, we stopped revising it. Because revising an official framework requires more political will than the evidence usually provides. Oh yes. Dren looked at the stack of archived documents on his desk. What did the framework get wrong? Lyra sat down, which she had not done. She was a precise and economical woman, and she did not make gestures without meaning them. It got the categories right, she said. The major ones, grief, joy, fear, anger, love, shame, pride, those exist in humans, they're real. The framework describes them accurately. What it got wrong was the relationship between them. Well, explain. The framework treats human emotions as discrete states. You are in one or you are in another. You transition between them. The transitions are documented, the triggers are documented, the physiological signatures are documented. All of that is accurate. She paused. What is not accurate is the assumption of discreteness. Human emotions are not discrete states. They are. She stopped. I have been trying to find the right word for 20 years. I don't have one. Try anyways. She thought for a long time. Simultaneous, she said finally. Humans experience multiple emotions at the same time in the same moment without any apparent conflict or resolution between them, not as a transitional state between one emotion and another, as a stable condition. They are not moving from grief to joy. They are in grief and joy together at the same moment, and both are real and both are full, and neither one cancels the other. Dren looked at her. That's not in the framework. No, the framework acknowledges mixed emotional states as transitional phenomena. It does not account for them as permanent features of human emotional experience. How long have you known this? 20 years, she said, since the first week I was on the project. Why hasn't it been published? She looked at him steadily. Because it requires rebuilding the framework from the beginning, and that requires arguing with 200 years of institutional momentum. She paused. Your predecessor understood this. She left you that note about running out of questions rather than data. She was pointing at this. She was telling me to start over. She was telling you someone needed to. Dren called a meeting of the full research team 2 weeks later. There were 14 of them. They came from 6 different civilizations. The project had always been structured as a collaborative endeavor, on the theory that multiple observational frameworks would produce more complete results than any single civilization's perspective could manage. In practice, this had created a team of remarkable and occasionally conflicting intelligence that had produced, over the decades, both the project's best insights and its most entrenched disagreements. He presented his analysis. He presented Lyra's observation about simultaneity. He laid out what the data showed when you looked for it, and there was data, decades of it, case after case of human emotional states that the existing taxonomy coded as mixed or transitional, but which, on closer examination, showed the physiological and behavioral signatures of fully realized emotional states occurring at the same time. The room was quiet when he finished. Then a researcher named Assessor Dren, who was on Dari and had been on the project for 45 years, and was the most senior member of the team by a significant margin, said, "We knew this." "I know," Dren said. "The data has shown this for a very long time." "As I know." "Why?" Callender said, with the particular careful precision of someone asking a question they already know the answer to. "Are we having this meeting now rather than 40 years ago?" "Because 40 years ago the framework was new and well-funded and had institutional support and nobody wanted to argue with it." Dren looked at him. "And because 40 years ago none of us were project-led." Callender was quiet. Then he made a gesture that Dren had learned over 3 weeks of working with him indicated something between acknowledgement and resignation. "What do you want to do?" Callender asked. "I want to go back to the beginning, not the project's beginning that was 200 years ago and we can't replicate those conditions. The beginning of the question, why do humans have the emotional structure they have? What does it do for them that a simpler structure woo? Zeldient do what is simultaneity for?" The room considered this. A researcher named Assessor Dren Sorath, who was human. The project had included human researchers for 60 years, which had produced its own complicated dynamics, said quietly, "Nobody has ever asked us that." The room looked at her. "In 200 years of study," she said, "nobody has asked the humans on the research team why we work the way we work. You've observed us, you've measured us, you've developed frameworks for describing us. But the question of function, what the emotional structure is for, that has been developed entirely from outside." She paused. "I have thoughts about this." "I imagine you do," Dren said. "Please share them." Priya Nandal had been on the project for 12 years. She was a cognitive neuroscientist by training, which had made her useful to the project in specific technical ways. She understood the human neurological data in ways that non-human researchers had to work harder to access, but which had also, she had always suspected, made her slightly invisible in the larger conversations about what the data meant. The framework questions, the taxonomic debates, the discussions of what emotional states were and how they related to each other, those had always been led by the non-human researchers, whose outside perspective was considered epistemically valuable in ways that her inside perspective was not. She had noted this asymmetry for 12 years without commenting on it, because she was careful and institutional, and understood that her job was to be useful within the project's structure rather than to argue with the structure itself. Dren's meeting was the first time, in 12 years, that she had been explicitly invited to say what she thought about the question the project was trying to answer. She took a breath and said what she thought. "The simultaneity isn't a design flaw," she said. "It isn't a transitional artifact or a processing limitation or a consequence of our neurological architecture being more primitive than more advanced emotional systems. It's adaptive. It does something." "What does it do?" Dren asked. "It lets us function during impossible situations." She paused, organizing something she had been thinking about for a long time into words. "When you are simultaneously in grief and gratitude, when someone you love has died and you are at their funeral, and you are devastated by the loss and also genuinely glad they existed and also frightened by your own mortality, and also feeling something close to joy when you remember a specific funny thing they did, all of those things are happening at the same time. And the reason you can keep standing, keep speaking, keep being present and useful to the people around you is not that you have resolved any of those states. It's that you can hold all of them at once. The simultaneity is load-bearing. It distributes the weight of experience across multiple emotional channels so that no single channel collapses under it." The room was very quiet. "You are describing," Callender said slowly, "a structural adaptation for surviving situations of extreme complexity." "I am describing why humans can function at funerals," Priya said, "and in combat, and at the bedsides of dying relatives, and in negotiations where the stakes are catastrophic, and in every situation where a simpler emotional system would either shut down or become non-functional. The simultaneity is not a messiness. It is a tolerance for complexity that allows continued operation under conditions that would incapacitate a system built on emotional discreteness. Dren said very quietly, "We have been studying human emotion as a phenomenon. We have not been studying it as a tool." "No," Priya said, "you haven't." The revised framework took 4 years to build. It was a genuine rebuilding, not a revision of the existing taxonomy but a new structure that started from function rather than from description. What does human emotion do? What problems does it solve? What would happen to human behavior and human civilizational capacity if the structure were simpler? The answers were, in their way, straightforward once the question was properly framed. Human emotional simultaneity allowed humans to maintain social function during periods of personal catastrophe. It allowed them to experience loss and continuity at the same time, which meant that grief did not necessitate withdrawal and recovery, did not require the loss to be resolved before function was restored. It allowed them to hold contradictory truths without requiring resolution, to love someone whose actions they found morally troubling, to maintain loyalty to an institution they were simultaneously critical of, to be afraid and courageous in the same moment. It made humor possible in dark circumstances, which was not trivial. The research team spent 3 months on humor alone because the capacity to find something genuinely fun and why in a context that was also genuinely terrible was not a coping mechanism in the way that the existing literature described it. It was a simultaneous registration of two incompatible truths, the severity of the situation and the absurdity of it, without requiring the human to choose which truth was more accurate. Both were true. Humor was the form that took. It made human loyalty structurally different from the loyalty observed in other civilizations. Where other species' loyalty tended to be conditional or hierarchical, stronger to immediate community, weaker to broader group, weakest to abstract principle, human loyalty operated across levels simultaneously. A human soldier could be simultaneously loyal to a specific comrade, to a unit, to a nation, and to an abstract principle of justice, and all four loyalties could be active and real in the same moment. This was not incoherence. It was a form of moral complexity that allowed humans to make decisions in situations where loyalty hierarchies would produce paralysis. The framework's concluding section, which Dren wrote himself after 3 months of drafts, stated, "Human emotion has been studied for 200 years as a psychological phenomenon, a feature of human inner life, interesting for what it revealed about human experience. This framework proposes a complementary understanding that human emotional structure is also a civilizational technology, not designed, evolved, but functional in the way that technologies are functional, solving specific problems that civilizations at scale invariably encounter. The problem of functioning under catastrophic loss, the problem of maintaining social cohesion under pressure, the problem of making decisions in situations of genuine moral complexity, the problem of sustaining loyalty across multiple levels of community simultaneously. Human emotional simultaneity addresses all of these problems. It does not solve them, but it creates the conditions under which they can be survived." The framework was presented to the Galactic Institute 18 months after completion. The reception was, as Lyra had predicted it would be, complicated. There was a substantial cohort of researchers who received it as a genuine advance and said so clearly and without reservation. There was a larger cohort who received it carefully, noting its merits while identifying areas that required further study, which was the standard institutional language for something between support and skepticism. And there was a smaller but not insignificant cohort who argued that the framework's central claim, that human emotional structure constituted a form of civilizational technology, was an overclaim, an interpretive leap beyond what 200 years of data could actually support. The debate ran for 2 years in the journals. Dren participated in it without particular anxiety. He had expected it. He had made peace early in the 4 years of building with the idea that what they were proposing would require time to be accepted, because what they were proposing required the field to understand something that the field had spent 2 centuries approaching from the wrong direction. What he had not expected was the response from outside the academic community. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps, which had been using the original Integrated Emotional Framework as its standard reference for 80 years, commissioned an internal review of the new framework 6 months after its publication. The review was conducted by a team of working diplomats rather than researchers, people whose professional lives involved daily contact with human negotiators and representatives, and whose interest in human emotional structure was not academic. The review concluded in 14 months. Its summary was 3 pages. The final paragraph was quoted in every subsequent discussion of the new framework that Dren encountered for the rest of his career. It said, the revised framework explains something that working diplomats have observed for decades without adequate theoretical grounding. When human negotiators are under extreme pressure, when the stakes are highest, when the situation is most complex, when other delegations are visibly struggling with the weight of the circumstances, humans do not simplify. They do not retreat to a reduced emotional register that prioritizes function over feeling. They become, if anything, more fully present, more complex. They bring more of themselves to the situation, not less. We have attributed this to individual character in exceptional people. The revised framework suggests it is a structural feature of the species. This changes in significant ways how we should understand what we are dealing with when we deal with humanity. Dren read the Diplomatic Corps review in his office on the station where the project had been housed for 2 centuries. He read it once. Then he set it down and looked out the viewport at the stars. All right. He thought about the first day. About Dr. Ven in a market in Istanbul trying to calibrate instruments against a taxonomy that began to fail within hours. He thought about 62 categories that didn't fit. About 200 years of careful, thorough, genuinely dedicated research that had mapped the territory accurately and then gotten the meaning of the map wrong. About the sentence his predecessor had left him, we have not run out of data. We have run out of the right questions. He thought about Priya Nandal saying, in a meeting room with 14 researchers, that no one had ever asked the humans on the team why they worked the way they worked. That was the thing that had stayed with him most, across 4 years of building and 18 months of presentation and 2 years of debate. Not the framework, not the conclusions. The question of who had been in the room and what kinds of knowing were considered legitimate. The project had been studying human emotion for 200 years. It had included human researchers for 60 of those years. And it had taken 200 years before someone thought to ask those researchers, "What do you think this is for?" He wrote a note in his personal record. It said, the most expensive mistake in 200 years of research was not methodological. It was the assumption that the thing being studied could only be understood from outside it. 20 years could have been saved by asking the right people the right question in the first decade, probably more. He paused, then he added one more lines. We ran out of categories on day 1. It took us 200 years to understand that this was the finding, not the problem. The project continued. It would always continue, Dren suspected. The study of human emotion was not the kind of inquiry that reached completion, not because humans were beyond understanding, but because understanding was itself a moving target, and humans were still in the process of becoming whatever they were going to be. New researchers joined, old ones retired, the data accumulated, the questions got better. Priya Nandal became the project's co-lead in the 7th year of Dren's tenure. It was the first time in 200 years that a human had held a leadership position on the project, which said something about 200 years that Dren preferred not to dwell on, but felt it was important not to pretend wasn't true. She was good at it. She was precise and she was generous, and she had the specific quality that the best researchers on the project had always had. She was genuinely interested in what she didn't know more than in what she did. On the project's 200th anniversary, which was also Dren's 15th year as lead, the Institute held a formal event, the kind of institutional acknowledgement that large, long-running projects periodically received. There were speeches, there was a formal reception, there was a publication of a commemorative volume that summarized 200 years of findings in a form accessible to researchers outside the field. Dren gave the main address. He spoke about the history of the project, about Dr. Ven in Istanbul, about 62 categories that didn't fit, about the generations of researchers who had built something genuine even while working with a framework that was only partly adequate to what they were looking at. He spoke about what 200 years of study had produced, which was not a complete understanding of human emotion. He said this clearly, but a genuine beginning of one. A set of questions that were actually the right questions. A framework that was built for function rather than description. A relationship between the field and its subject that was, for the first time, actually collaborative. He ended with something that was not in his prepared remarks. He had not planned to say it. It came from somewhere in the 15 years of work and the 4 years of building and the specific morning when he had read his predecessor's note and started looking for the moment the surprise ended. He said, "We began this project believing that 20 years would be enough to understand human emotion. We are 200 years in, we have not finished. We will not finish in my lifetime, and I doubt we will finish in the lifetimes of the researchers currently in this room. I used to think this was a problem with the project. I now think it is evidence of something about the subject. What we have been studying for 200 years is a civilization that has not finished becoming what it is going to be. The emotional structure we have been trying to map is not a fixed territory. It is a living system, still developing, still finding new forms for things that have no previous forms. We ran out of categories on day one because the categories were never going to be enough. They were never going to be enough because what we were looking at was not a collection of states to be classified. It was a capac. ID, an ongoing capacity for a kind of inner complexity that does not resolve and does not simplify and does not, at any point in 200 years of observation, appear to be finished. He paused. I find this at this stage of my career less daunting than I once would have. We have been given an inexhaustible subject. For researchers, there are worse problems to have. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the room followed. And Dren stood at the podium and accepted it with the particular feeling of a person who has said something true and knows it and is glad. Even though truth is rarely tidy, and this particular truth had taken 200 years and several generations of researchers, and one human neuroscientist asking to be heard in a meeting, to become visible enough to say,